Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to go over what a transcendental mental state is. So very important. So in chapter 5, we basically talked about how your subconscious is in its ground state when your body is doing most of the commanding, right? But when your conscious mind has a way. We didn't really go over how. We'll actually talk about it in this chapter. But we said that the conscious mind has an ability, right, to essentially launch your subconscious out of its ground state. Now, when the subconscious leaves its ground state, it's now in its excited state, right? And in an excited state, it's being mostly commanded by your conscious mind. Now, remember what we said in the last video. So different states of awareness correspond to your subconscious activity. They basically just represent classifications, or they reference different types of subconscious activity or different classifications of subconscious activity. So when your subconscious is in its excited state, based on that framework, your awareness of reality or the state of awareness is going to change. So that's actually exactly what a transcendental mental state refers to. So just to go over this first point, when your subconscious leaves its ground state, it enters an excited state, and this state corresponds to a transcendental state of awareness. So this is very important. It's very important. So we're going to talk about how to enter a transcendental state later. But when your subconscious is in its ground state, that's when you're in a normal, what we call a normal state of awareness, which refers to basically just using your negative mind and your negative mind's mental abilities. But when you use your intention in a certain way, which we'll talk about later, your subconscious enters excited state, subconscious activity changes, and your experience or your state of awareness changes, or your experience of reality changes. And that's called the transcendental mental state. So before we get into how to enter it, like I said, we'll talk about later, what does it feel like? How would we describe a transcendental mental state, or what happens when your subconscious enters an excited state? Well, to go over this next point, when you enter an excited state, basically it feels kind of like a dream state, but not as pronounced as when you're actually dreaming. So that makes sense, right? So when your subconscious is in its ground state, it's being primarily commanded by your body, and it's kind of locked, right? It's in a very kind of locked in state, which you can almost compare to a solid, right? So when physical matter is in a solid state, its volume is very fixed, right? It doesn't change very much. It's very rigid, right? But when it enters a liquid state, its volume changes, and it can take the shape of whatever container it's in, right? So not the really container part, but that's kind of what happens with your subconscious. When your subconscious is no longer in its ground state, or leaves its ground state, it's in a sense almost much freer. It's not as locked in to some state of subconscious activity as it is when it's in its ground state. So basically when you dream, right? When you dream, your subconscious is no longer in its ground state. It's much more free, right? So it flows more, right? And that's why your experience of reality when you're dreaming is so different from when you're awake. Now, when you're in a transcendental state, your subconscious also leaves that ground state. So it becomes more free. So it's going to feel a little more like a dream, but it's not as much like a dream. Your subconscious isn't quite as free, right, as when you're actually dreaming, but it's a little bit free. It's almost kind of like it's kind of like an ionic bond, right, or an ionized compound. So when an electron is, this is in chemistry. I learned this a long time ago. But when when two chemicals bond, right, there's different types of bonds. So there's covalent bond, or polar, non-polar covalent bond, but there's also an ionic bond. So in an ionic bond, an electron is much further away from the atom. The atom that it's actually, well, I don't know what the word is, that actually it's held to, right? Because the atom basically has to have a certain number. The same number of electrons has protons, right? Now there are different energy levels and energy shells, and depending on how complete or full the energy shell is, the electron may have a higher voltage or a higher affinity for giving up an electron, or basically absorbing or taking on an electron, right? Because it basically wants a full shell. So if it has to give up electrons to have a full shell, then it'll do that. I think that's how metals are, right? If it has to absorb electrons to get a full shell, then it'll do that, and it'll have a higher voltage for doing that. And that's like non-metals, right? So metals generally conduct electricity because they want to give up electrons so that they have a full shell. So in an ionic bond, right, an electron will kind of hang out or hover further away from the atom in order to form a bond, so that it's easier for the element or the compound to have, or easier for the atom to have a full shell. I could be wrong about that, so the physicists would have to fact check me. That's what I remember about it. But anyway, the reason I'm getting into all that is to say that your subconscious is almost in an ionized state. So it's not a completely free, it's almost like the state is almost represents an electron, right? So your subconscious isn't in a completely free state where it's flowing like a current, right? The electron would when you have an electric current, right? But it's still not quite in its ground state either, right? Like it would when the atom's in its ground state, or for a polar covalent bond, right? So it's a little bit ionized or a little bit free, but not all the way. So probably not the best example, because now I'm thinking about it now, but I think you get what I'm saying, right? So as the subconscious moves away from its ground state, it starts to have properties that represent the dream state. But this is, when you're in a transcendental state, you're kind of in between those states. So just to describe a little bit more about what that state feels like, because this is a state you have to enter to charge your subconscious. So we're going to talk, like I said, about this state for most of the chapter. So it's important for you to recognize when you've entered this state, right? So when you're in this state, you're going to feel stronger compulsions from your subconscious, just like you do in a dream. So when you're dreaming, right, you'll feel random compulsions, right? You'll remember things in a dream that never happened in reality, right? That's actually a part of your subconscious compulsion. That's part of the that's part of your subconscious ability to alter your perception, right? So it alters your belief, right? So you'll believe and remember things that never happened or whatever. There will be a whole history in your dream, right? That's not coming from your physical memory or the memory from your brain. We'll talk more about memory next chapter. But that's coming from the information contained within the compulsion, and it's just a form of altered perception, right? So when you're dreaming, you'll feel compelled to remember things. You'll feel compelled to do things, right? You'll just know things in a dream, right? Which all is a form of, that's also a form of transcendental belief, right? But you'll feel urges to go here in your dream, and go here, or go there, or do this, right? So all of this, and also you'll feel a compulsion to feel things, because emotion's included in your compulsions. So that all happens in dreams because your subconscious is in a free state, right? So it's in a more free state, and it can compel you much more powerfully. So the same thing happens when you enter a transcendental state, right? You'll feel stronger compulsions. These compulsions will make you feel urges to think, do, and believe things, right? And feel things, right? So it's basically just going to be like a daydream. It'll feel kind of very similar to a daydream when you enter a transcendental state. Well, pretty much, I think we could say it is a daydream, right? But we're going to talk about it much more mechanically, so the term daydream it won't exactly feel precise, but for the most part, you could think of it as a date. When you enter a transcendental state, it's going to feel very much like the way your awareness feels when you're having a daydream. So that's pretty much it for the video, but this last part, when I talk about the term transcendental state, that's actually not really a new term, right? That's the term I like to use, but colloquially, if I'm saying that right, transcendental states are colloquially referred to by the term trance. So you've probably heard that many times, right? So you've heard when a person meditates or when they're being hypnotized, they undergo hypnosis, they're entering a trance state, or they're trying to enter a trance, right? That's actually exactly what I'm talking about when I say a transcendental mental state. It refers to a trance. Now, the term trance is to me, it sounds like a very loaded term because it's used in different contexts. And a lot of times when people think of a trance, they're thinking of like sometimes it's referred to like a half awake, half asleep state. Other times it can refer to a sort of hypnotic state when you're very suggestible, or when you're able to when a person is easily able to plant suggestions into your mind, which that's also true. But all of those terms are really just referring to a transcendental mental state, right? They're referring to when your subconscious enters a more free state, right? And it's true, you are able to. It's very easy to receive suggestions to your subconscious in that state, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is throughout the chapter. So, but here's the thing: just like we said in the last chapter, when you're watching a movie, right, and you feel emotion, the reason you're able to feel more emotion is because you enter a transcendental state. And in that transcendental state, your subconscious uses its transcendental mental abilities, right? So you use your positive mind, which includes emotions. So the reason you're able to feel emotions and strong beliefs or transcendental beliefs while watching a movie is because you enter a transcendental state while doing it, or you enter a trance, right? So a lot of people don't associate trances with watching a movie or listening to music or playing sports or hanging out with friends, right? So that's why I don't like to use that term. Trance is kind of a loaded term that's associated with many different contexts. But really, what it's referring to is exactly what I'm referring to by the term transcendental state. So for the rest of the book, just know that the term trance or trance state is really the same as what I'm referring to here, but I like to use the term transcendental state or transcendental mental state. So I think just when I look at the book, I actually forgot what the next section is. I know what the whole chapter is about, but I just want to focus on the order. So the next section in the book is the subtlety of transcendental states. I wonder if I could just talk about that in this video. Yeah, I think I'm just going to go over transcendental. I'm going to go over the next section in this video. So I didn't write obviously I didn't write anything down, but it's not like a big section. So now I want to talk about the subtlety of transcendental states, right? Which is very simple. Basically what I talk about in the book is just the simple fact that when you enter a transcendental state, and I think in the next video we're actually going to talk about how to enter a transcendental state. But when you are entering a transcendental state, it's actually a gradual process, right? So it's not instantaneous. So for example, when you're going to sleep, right? When you're going to sleep, your subconscious activity is changing. So it's going from being in its ground state to now being in a super excited state, which represents you dreaming, right? So that process doesn't happen instantly. It's not like you snap a finger, now you're in an excited state and you're dreaming. No, it works gradually, slowly. So just like when you're heating up physical matter, right, to enter a liquid state, it happens slowly. As you heat it up, it starts melting, and some of the material is now a liquid, some more of the material is now a liquid, until all of it's a liquid. So it's a gradual process, right? So your subconscious is exactly the same way. In order to change the subconscious state or subconscious activity from one state to another, in such a way that reflects a different state of awareness, right? It's a gradual process. And that's going to be important for when we start talking about how to enter a transcendental state and how to charge the subconscious and things like that. So, but not only does it occur gradually, you also feel it gradually, right? Because when you go to sleep, right, and you dream, your body stops doing the charging. So it's basically doing most of the work for you. So even though it's gradual, the effect will be very, very pronounced, right? In other words, the experience of reality is very different without the conscious mind doing much. However, that's not how it works when you're entering a transcendental state, because your body's still charging your subconscious at the ground state level. So your conscious mind has to do much more of the work, right? And so when you're experiencing that gradual change from a ground state, from the way your awareness feels when you're in a ground state, so you're just regular waking day, when you finally enter a transcendental state, right, even though it occurs gradually, it won't be very powerful. So the compulsions in a dreamlike state won't be that strong, but it is there, right? This is important because when you first enter a transcendental state for the first time, it's very subtle, right? It's hard to notice, right? So, for example, when you're watching a movie, you enter a trance all the time, or you enter a transcendental state all the time when you're watching a movie, but you don't notice it, right? It's very subtle, right? So in order to learn how to charge your subconscious, you have to learn how to catch it and recognize it when it's happening, right? So it starts off very subtle when you that dream state-like feeling and those stronger compulsions and the compulsions to do this and do that and feel that, they're all there, but they're very, very weak, right? But as you charge your subconscious more and more and more, then all of those effects get way stronger. Then it's very easy to know this. Like, you can't miss it, right? So as you charge your subconscious more, it feels much more like you're in a dream state. And that's pretty much what we were talking about transcendental imagination. So it's going to, that when you enter that dream state or that daydream-like state, you're going to be much more, your imagination is going to feel much more vivid, just like a regular dream does. Right? Your transcendental beliefs, your feelings, your emotions are all going to be much more powerful or feel much more intense, right? And that happens as your subconscious charges more and more and more. So at the beginning of a subconscious charge, right, the transcendental state's very subtle, and you might even just miss it, right? And that's why a lot of people don't know how to charge their subconscious consciously, because they always miss when it happens. You have to catch it to charge it properly, which we'll talk about throughout the chapter. But yeah, at the beginning it's very subtle and most people miss it. But if you know how to catch it and you know what to do when you do catch it, which we'll talk about, then you can charge your subconscious. Then your subconscious enters more and more and more. It basically gets more and more excited, right? Just like an atom, right? An electron, when an electron gains more energy and an atom enters excited state, as the electron gains more and more energy, then you can say the atom becomes more and more excited, right? Or enters more and more of an excited state. So your subconscious is the same way. And as it charges up more and becomes more and more excited, the transcendental state becomes more and more pronounced, like I said, until eventually you can't possibly miss it. In fact, as it charges even more, right, let's say you're charging it for the purpose of transcendental creativity or transcendental performance, it becomes so excited that it just starts to stay there, right? And then that's when you're in the zone as it relates to performance. So it's like it'll feel like you're almost stuck in a transcendental mental state while you're performing some activity, right? And then it feels very much almost like a dream state. You're feeling all types of compulsions and urges to do certain things. And that's why when you're in the zone, a lot of times it'll feel like the experience is happening almost automatically, just like it does with a dream. But what's really happening is that's your subconscious or your positive mind doing most of the thinking, which we'll talk about that later in the chapter. We haven't really spoke about that yet. But for now, pretty much like in a dream, it feels like your subconscious, it feels like everything's happening almost automatically, and your conscious mind or your free will isn't really doing much, right? That's exactly how it feels when you're in the zone. And that comes from the fact that your subconscious is now almost stuck in an excited state. So it's definitely not subtle at all, right, when it's charged up. But when your subconscious is first starting a charge, the experience of a transcendental state is very subtle, right, and it's harder to catch. So that's important. That's very important because you have to learn how to catch it, and then if you do, you're going to learn how to charge your subconscious so that you bring it from that very subtle state to a state that's very easy to notice, and it's much easier to control your subconscious when it's excited like that. So yeah, I decided to include the next section in this video. So the next video, we're actually going to talk about how to enter a transcendental state. I think, and then I don't think we're going to talk about how the charging process works, but pretty much that's the beginning of the charging process. I think later in the chapter we'll talk about how the subconscious actually charges. But we're just going to talk about for now how to enter a transcendental state, right? So yeah, that's everything for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.